Welcome to our August Planet Possible MiniPod. I'm Niki Roach, and this is a monthly update where we react to current events in water, climate and nature. And it's a MiniPod because it'll only take about 15 minutes of your time, and it means you get a Planet Possible episode every 2 weeks. We're grateful to our sponsors, BMA, Mackley and MWH Treatment for helping us bring this MiniPod to you. And as usual, I'm joined by an environmental expert, and we're going to explore 3 issues that are making the headlines, keeping you right up to date with what's happening around the world and where my guest sees some exciting possibilities. And this MiniPod, my guest is Hannah Burgess, CIWEM President, and we'll be talking about the consultation on how flood funding is awarded, which opens the door to more voluntary groups and environmental NGOs directly accessing funding. The news that a global plastics treaty is being debated alongside some ideas for individual actions. And we consider the updated national sustainable drainage standards that should drive more consistency in what's delivered. So welcome to the MiniPod, Hannah. You're coming to the end of your year as president of CIWEM. So just before we get into the MiniPod, what's your biggest takeaway from what I would imagine has been quite an extraordinary year?
I think my biggest takeaway is really how rewarding it has been to get out and about and meet our members. What I see consistently is a real passion for really making a difference to how we manage our water environment. And one really interesting thing for me has been seeing the spectrum of what gets done, from taking part in a conference on drinking water safety in Hong Kong to wider stuff around water quality, taking part in things like Rivers Trust conference on blue-green algae. It's been such a varied year, and also the impact that our theme of the presidential ripple effect has been having in empowering people to realise that they are change makers and a force for good.
So let's start with flood funding and the recent consultation. What's the news here, Hannah?
The news is that there's been a recent government consultation which closed at the end of July on partnership funding. So the government's partnership funding policy came in 2011, following the review of the 2007 floods, to seek to bring external contributions into flood alleviation to be more delivered for society using both public and private funds. The news is that there has been a big consultation on how partnership funding operates, taking into account almost a decade and a half of experience implementing this policy. And the partnership funding consultation has looked at 2 things. It's looked at how much funding can be made available for flood and coastal schemes. And then the second part is, how does that funding get prioritised?
And what do you imagine, I guess, the impact of this consultation could be, as somebody who's, as you say, kind of, this is your day job, this is the space that you've been working in for a while?
Absolutely. And when I worked for Staffordshire County Council, I managed a programme of schemes, and I saw firsthand the impact that partnership funding was having on our ability to deliver schemes for smaller communities. And the types of things we were trying to deliver as well were quite different to major river and coastal schemes. They were schemes that involved measures to protect property, so property flood resilience. They had elements of natural flood management, and they also had elements of managing excess flows and working with partners, such as water companies, the Environment Agency, to look at integrated flood risk challenges. So, I really think this new funding consultation will have a big impact, because one of the things that the consultation is looking at is fully funding schemes that are below £3 million in terms of capital investment. And actually, when I look back on that programme of schemes we had, that would make a massive difference at both the pace and the speed and the ability to deliver those schemes on the ground, because currently you can only get a certain amount of funding based on the outcomes a scheme delivers, and typically those smaller schemes have a lower number of properties that they protect, but often those properties are very frequently flooded compared to big river and coastal schemes, which can have thousands of properties affected. So it'll make a big difference, I think, to those communities.
And do you think the types of solutions that you're likely to see are going to be different? If you're doing smaller scale schemes, for example, are you going to see more nature-based solutions, do you think, coming through because of this? Or
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we will still see major investment in large flood and coastal schemes, given the challenge of climate change and ageing assets. So this is about having a wider spectrum of things that can be delivered rather than either or. But I think this will see a big... So the government, when you look at the consultation and looking at how do you prioritise and start to mainstream So natural flood management, learning from previous pilot studies, and property flood resilience as well. Maybe some upstream natural flood management in rural areas holding water back. There may be some retrofit sustainable drainage systems in urban areas, combined with small flood walls, bunds, storage areas, combined with property flood resilience. And that's my biggest hope for the changes in partnership funding, that it really delivers those integrated schemes for communities.
Okay, let's move from flood funding in the UK to something international, something that piqued my interest, completely different really. So scientists estimate that there are over 170 trillion pieces of plastic floating in the world's oceans, and that this could triple by 2040 if we don't do something different. And this is data from a 2023 study led by Marcus Ericsson from the Five Gaias Institute in California. I'll pop a link to that in the notes. 475 million tonnes of plastic produced in 2022. And what's even more alarming for me is that that's growing at a rate of nearly 9% a year. 60% of plastics are single use. So in 2022, countries agreed to develop a legally binding global treaty to cut plastic waste and the harmful chemicals that plastics contain. But as of yet, there has been no agreement reached. And so I was interested, I picked up a BBC News article about a UN conference in Geneva in early August to try and agree actually globally with 170 countries, how to try and curb these plastic excesses. But on a personal level, and as someone who, I guess, a bit like yourself, considers themselves an environmentalist, although a very imperfect one, I've just started reading a book, not an ad, but it's called The Joyful Environmentalist by a lady called Isabel Lasada. I love Isabel's suggestion. It feels very Planet Possible. She says, make a game of it. Start with a plastic that you only use once, and begin with the obvious stuff. So things like, and as a stationery addict, plastic pens, how do we eliminate plastic pens from our lives? Not impossible. Refills for shampoos and soaps rather than buying new plastic bottles. Think about where we buy our fruit and veggies from. Great to see something happening globally, but also I'm feeling quite inspired by the book. What are your thoughts?
I think my first thought on that, actually describing ourselves as imperfect environmentalists is actually quite helpful, because we all feel like we can do more, but if we put pressure on ourselves to reach the ideal, how realistic is that in today's world? It's not to say it's something we shouldn't aspire to. We don't want that to demotivate us, lose that energy to do what we can. I'm getting increasingly frustrated when I try and buy products and they come in plastic. I get a weekly veg box that comes of odd-shaped vegetables and fruit. One of the reasons is that it comes in a cardboard box. Everything's in paper bags. It's not all wrapped in plastic. Whereas if I compared that to how much plastic if I'd bought the same things from the supermarket, it would be quite a difference. All of those things make a difference. Am I perfect in this? No. Do I beat myself up if I get a coffee from a coffee shop in a disposable cup? Yes. But actually, it's always, like you said, taking stock and thinking, okay, what am I doing and what changes can I make? And then sharing the changes that you make with other people as well, because you will learn something from them and they will learn something from you.
I think you're right. Let's be imperfect environmentalists, I think, together. And it's that balance. It's like not being preachy, but sharing in the hope that others go, oh, I'd never even thought about that. That's a really easy switch. I'll just do that too. Love it. Okay, let's move on to our third topic. So what are the news around the sustainable drainage standards, Hannah?
So the government has recently published new standards for sustainable drainage systems in new developments. So these standards were previously published a few years ago. They mainly focused on the quantity of water coming off new developments, and then it was down to lead local flood authorities, which are local councils in England and Wales. Wales is slightly different now, but certainly in England, to then come up with local standards that picked up the wider pillars of SUDS. So when we think about SUDS, there are 4 pillars. There is water quantity, water quality, amenity and biodiversity. And what the new standards do is fill in the gaps, really. So there should be some national consistency around delivering SUDS that meet all 4 pillars. One of the things I like to do in my own time when I go out for runs is find new footpaths. And I'm like, oh, there's a new development. I'm going to go and see the SUDS systems. I've got to the point where I have many, many photos taken whilst out on runs of what I would call the anti-SUDS. And the anti-SUDS, to me, is effectively what we might term a bomb crater-sized pond on the edge of a development. Interestingly, I have friends that don't work in this sector that have looked at these things on developments near them and gone, oh, that will make the village flood. Actually, they're designed to do the complete opposite. But that's the perception, which was a really interesting insight, I think, for us as professionals. What does wider society think about these features? But actually, you know, if we think about the kind of streets we would like to live in, what do those look like? Are they sterile and hard paved, and the water gets away as quickly as possible into gullies, into drains, into sewers? Then we've got the cost of, you know, water treatment. Or do we want to live, you know, in what I might call a climate resilient street with trees and nature and rain gardens? There's research that shows that living in such streets has, you know, great benefits to well-being, for example, as well as urban cooling. And actually, surely through new developments, this is exactly what we should be doing. Designing the streets that we want to live in rather than doing more of the same. I still feel like some of the previous standards, whilst well intended, the national standards were pushing people towards that big storage pond or underground storage, which effectively maintains what we currently think of as an urban street, but actually isn't a climate resilient street and doesn't provide those wider benefits as well, and causes more challenges in the long term for maintenance, for water quality, etc.
We heard from George Clark, architect and TV presenter, in our August episode. One of the things he talked about with the built environment and how we just make it a more pleasant place to be. One of the things that really interests me around sustainable drainage is who owns it, who's responsible for it. Because where I live in Leeds, there are some beautiful rain gardens, and they were beautiful, and now they're kind of less beautiful. Rather like you, my phone is full of all sorts of weird pictures of infrastructure, including some ones I was fortunate enough to see in Paris a few months ago. And they are utterly spectacular. The street looks phenomenal. Do the SUD standards address who should own and who should maintain these assets?
Very interesting question, Niki. Yes and no. So one of the 7 standards is around operation and maintenance. The approach in Wales is different to England. That is because in Wales they've implemented Schedule 3 of the Flood and Water Management Act, which means that lead local flood authorities, also known as SUD's approving bodies and adoption bodies, so those local authorities, which are all unitary councils in Wales, are responsible not only for approving SUD systems but then adopting them. Whereas in England we haven't moved to that yet. And hopefully we will do in time, and CIWEM's been calling for that for some time, because that is one of the biggest challenges. The people that have gone out and constructed those developments had the right drawings, have they constructed what was intended, have they had the right skills to build some of these more kind of green features. So what is actually on site is one challenge, but actually how do you then maintain that? And there's been research done in various different places to look at, well, actually, what do these sites look like when you go back to them over time? And that is one of the challenges. How do you maintain those systems? And who has the overall responsibility? Because actually there's different grass cutting cycles, you know, for different types of features, different maintenance requirements, and there's also the question to think about. So if you say a typical residential development, say 100 years, okay, so you go in and you put petrol interceptors in, flow control features in, actually those individual components of that development are unlikely to have a 100-year life cycle. Who's going to pay to replace those? Who's going to be looking at that overall? And that's one of the challenges when you've got those private maintenance companies that often get involved, as they're not necessarily looking at that kind of whole life maintenance approach either.
It sounds like Wales, I mean, from what you're saying, has got the right idea really, which is they become a local authority asset. Well, it'll be interesting to see as they get adopted, and I guess it sounds like we're pushing for Schedule 3 adoption as well very strongly in England. So Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. That is unfortunately all we have time for, but you've given us plenty to think about. And thank you for joining us on the MiniPod. You can subscribe to Planet Possible on your usual podcast player to never miss an episode, and we love to hear your ratings and reviews too. We've got more fantastic guests and topics lined up for the rest of this year, including our September episode where I visit Havant Thicket, the site of the first new reservoir to be built in England in 30 years. So I hope you'll join us for that. That's it, everyone. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you next time.